Hello everybody, welcome to this first episode of the Holy Paladin Beginner Guide, where we're gonna be looking at the core rotation of Holy Paladin, going over the basic spells and how they should flow in PvE combat. The guide will be addressed to PvE, but it will also apply in some capacity to PvP. So this first episode, we're gonna be covering that, and we'll follow it up with some more episodes in the next couple of days, covering other aspects a bit more in depth of Holy Paladin. So if you're interested in that, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, give a like on the video, and let's get into it. Right, so welcome to my UI, and let's take it from the very beginning. We Holy Paladins have two resources. We have mana, which we consume with pretty much any spell, and we also have Holy Power. We can have all the way up to 5 Holy Power, and we have 3 abilities that generate Holy Power, as well as 3 abilities that will consume the Holy Power. So we're going to be starting by talking about the abilities that generate the Holy Power, and then we'll move on to talking about the abilities that consume it and when and why you want to be using which of them. Our 3 spells that generate Holy Power are the following. First of all, we have Holy Shock, which is going to be doing a little bit of damage if we use it on an enemy, or it's going to be doing some healing if we use it on an ally. All of these together with giving us 1 Holy Power. So if we use it right there, you will see it's going to be giving us Holy Power, as well as doing a bit of damage. If we use it on an ally, once again, it's going to be giving us some healing. Oh, the ally just disconnected, but yeah, it would also heal the ally and give us the Holy Power. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and it's the one that I would say that you have to always keep on cooldown, because it's the only generator spell that also heals as well as gives you Holy Power, and the healing that it does is pretty strong. So whenever you have doubts of what to do, using Holy Shock and keeping it on cooldown should be your main go-to. It's also going to be consuming quite a hefty amount of mana, so mana is something you also got to keep in mind. Now next up we have Crusader Strike. That's the reason why Holy Power or Holy Paladin is considered to be a melee healer, because it's gonna require you to be on melee, and it's pretty simple. It's just gonna be whacking the enemy for a bit of damage. It actually does quite a bit of damage, and it's gonna give you 1 Holy Power. Now it also has 2 charges, not baseline, but if you pick a talent, which you are always gonna be picking in PvE, it's gonna be giving you a second charge of Crusader Strike, meaning you can use it 2 times in a row. You can let 1 charge recharge, you can let it go all the way to 2 charges and cap it. You can do as you please with it. I would usually use this spell at the second priority list. So my priority list would be to use first Holy Shock and then Crusader Strike. Why is that? As we mentioned, because Holy Shock would be healing, so I would be healing allies with it, whereas Crusader Strike would just be doing damage and giving me the Holy Power. But if I want to be healing, I would always be using Holy Shock first before Crusader Strike. Now last on the generator list, there is Hammer of Wrath, which is only going to be usable when you have Wings active, so your major cooldown, Avenging Wrath or Wings. Whenever this is active, you can use Hammer of Wrath. As you can see, I throw a hammer, but you can also use it whenever the enemy is below 20% HP. Now what this ability does is it simply throws a hammer at the enemy. It does a little bit of damage, and it's gonna generate 1 Holy Power. It doesn't cost any mana, and that's a very good part of it. Because in contrast with Crusader Strike would cost quite a huge amount of mana actually, and it would do a bit more damage than a Hammer of Wrath, but it's pretty close. It's actually kind of just the same about. So in an equal term situation, which one would you use? Depends on whether you want to keep mana or not. Depends on what your priority would be. So I would personally use Hammer of Wrath before Crusader Strike if I have it available, simply because it costs no mana, it's ranged, and it doesn't have a charge, so using it on cooldown means you are gonna get another another use of Hammer of Wrath as soon as possible. And therefore my priority list for using the generator spells would be to use Holy Shock first always, then Hammer of Wrath if available, and finally use Crusader Strike whenever we want to be doing some damage and generating some Holy Power. As we mentioned before, we have 3 spenders for our Holy Power, and they all consume 3 Holy Power. And those are the following. So Word of Glory is the first one we're going to be talking about. It's a burst of healing on a single ally for 3 Holy Power. It does quite a meaningful amount of healing on that ally, but that's it. It just heals an ally. It doesn't cost any mana. It's pretty simple. Next up we have Light of Dawn. It's going to be doing a frontal cone of healing in front of us on a 50-yard range, and it's going to be healing up to 5 injured allies. It also counts you if you're injured, that is. and it's gonna be individually doing not that much healing, but if you add up the total healing, if you hit 5 targets, you will be doing quite more healing than if you used a Word of Glory. So for the value of the healing that you get out of Light of Dawn, you would rather use Light of Dawn if possible versus using a Word of Glory. There's going to be more nuance to it, we'll discuss it in a second. And finally we have Shield of the Righteous, that's our last spender. It also costs 3 Holy Power. They don't cost any mana, by the way, the spenders, none of them cost mana, that's a big plus about them. And it's gonna be doing some damage to enemies in front of us in a frontal cone, much like Light of Dawn, but in this case it's gonna be doing a little bit of damage. It doesn't have a target cap, so you can hit as many enemies as there is in front of you for an individual amount of damage that's not too big. It's also gonna be giving you a massive amount of armor, which is gonna be giving you the chance, or it's gonna be reducing the physical damage you take, so that's pretty handy in many scenarios, especially in Mythic Plus. For example, if you are playing with Spiteful, the Spiteful will do a lot less damage to you because of this. So when do you want to be using which of the spenders? Well, that's a lot of nuance to each of them, but Word of Glory is much more heavily used in Mythic Plus. As a general rule of thumb, that's what we do, we use Word of Glory, and in raids we use Light of Dawn. So if you have any questions about what to do with your Holy Power, that should be your go-to. Your raiding, just use it on Light of Dawn. You are doing Mythic Plus, just use it on Word of Glory, but you have to keep in mind other things, because sometimes the nature of the damage requires you to use a different spell. Maybe there's a lot more single target healing required, maybe it's a lot more AoE healing required. And there's also the fact that Light of Dawn does more healing, so if you are able to hit at least 4 or more people with Light of Dawn, even in Mythic Plus, it's always going to be more worth it, and you're going to get more value out of your Holy Power if you use a Light of Dawn. But in order to keep things extremely simple, if you do not want to get confused, Light of Dawn for raiding and Word of Glory for Mythic Plus. What about Shield of the Righteous? If you want to be doing damage in Mythic Plus and you don't have to heal because there's no damage happening, use your Holy Power onto Shield of the Righteous, you will do some damage. And in raids, you can also do the same, but as a general rule of thumb as well, I wouldn't complicate my life too much, and I would rather just focus on using your healing spells, using everything pretty much on Light of Dawn, and that's about it. Now, as you might have seen in my UI, next to the 2 spells that we already talked about as core rotational spells, there's also 2 other spells that I haven't mentioned, and those are Judgment and Consecration. So the way I want you to think about these 2 spells is that they are filler spells in your rotation. On their own, they don't interact with your core kit of Holy Power. They don't really give you any Holy Power, they don't do much healing on their own. There's ways of them doing some healing and some damage, but for the sake of rotation, they are quite filler. So if you don't know, Judgment throws a hammer, does a little bit of damage, and that's about it. You can enhance this with some talents to make it do some healing, and to also make it increase the damage you do whenever you hit a target, the target that you just use Judgment on. But let's keep it simple. Judgment does some damage from afar, and that's about it. Consecration, you go in melee and it throws an AoE ground, a pool of consecrated ground on the floor, and it's gonna be doing some ticking damage to enemies in there. It doesn't have a target cap, so it's a lot more used in Mythic Plus and in raids because it's gonna be doing quite some damage. And the damage from it is also increased when you have wings active, so it's a very, very strong spell, and it's gonna be our top damage spell in Mythic Plus. I want you to use it a lot in Mythic Plus. In fact, it should always be down on the floor in Mythic Plus. If you are not struggling with healing and you are trying to do damage, you should always have this on the ground, so that's one thing that's very important about it. But in raids, we try and we don't really give it a lot of prio. It's a very, very filler spell, so don't really stress too much about these 2 things. Judgment on its own, simply some damage, so don't worry too much about it, doesn't do much. And Consecration, a lot of AoE damage in Mythic Plus, so try to always keep it down if possible. Now, you might have noticed that I haven't talked at all about our casting spells, and if you're somebody that hasn't been playing Holy Paladin for a while, we are pretty much never using these spells in PvE content nowadays. Now in PvP they use them a lot, but in PvE they are pretty much a trap. If you are using them a lot heavily right now, I strongly advise you to forget that they exist pretty much. They are a trap, and if you are using them a lot, it's gonna hinder the way and your path towards learning how to play Holy Paladin, because they should not be something that you rely on to heal. They should be like a last resource or even a cooldown if you have some talents, but on their own, they do not have a place in the core rotation of a Holy Paladin right now. So They are still there, and I'm gonna mention them for the sake of it. We still have our Holy Light, which is gonna be doing is a longer cast, and it's gonna be doing a big bunch of healing, and it costs a little bit of mana. And then we have Flash of Light, which is a faster cast. It does a bit less healing, and it costs more mana. On top of that, we also have Infusion of Light, which is going to generate whenever we critical strike with a Holy Shock. So we passively generate Infusion of Light. And Infusion of Light, it's a buff that gets consumed whenever we either cast a Flash of Light or a Holy Light. When we consume Infusion of Light with Holy Light, we do generate 1 Holy Power. So that's one reason why you want to be casting sometimes a Holy Light, but not really. And whenever you use a Flash of Light and consume Infusion of Light, you just have a lesser mana cost. So those are the interactions between Infusion of Light and the casting spells. And I strongly advise you not to fall in the trap of staying in ranged and actually spamming a lot of Flash of Light or Holy Light. They are not the go-to for healing and should be avoided unless you have a lot more knowledge of what you're doing. And of course, how could we forget, as we mentioned before, we have our major cooldown, we have Wings or Avenging Wrath, we pop it and we're gonna be doing 20% more damage and healing. It's also gonna be reducing the cooldown of Holy Shock by 40%. And if we are also speccing into this talent, we will be getting 20% increased critical strike as well for everything we do. So it's a very strong cooldown, 2-minute cooldown, and it's gonna last for 25 seconds. So yeah, you want to be using this as often as possible as a general rule of thumb. Depending on the situation, you might want to be waiting a little bit with it, or maybe just delaying it until the damage is going to be actually happening. But if you don't want to be complicating too much and you don't have knowledge of the damage patterns or whatnot, using it as often as possible should be the go-to. And we did leave a lot of things out of this video because there's a lot to cover, and we'll get into it in the further episodes of this series because it's going to be an ongoing series. We'll get into builds and individual talents and whatnot for the playstyle of Holy Paladin much more in depth later on. But now I want to bring you some gameplay, as I promised, a much more practical example of what I meant by this rotation. So here we have a clip of some boss, the third boss in the Nokud offensive. It's slow down, so you're gonna see that you're gonna have to focus down here as well as on my UI. There's this add-on that I have is going to show what spells I'm using in what order, so you can look down there and realize what I'm doing. But there's also my UI, so you can look at the cooldown of the spells, as we mentioned before, where they are, you know where they are. And yeah, let's go through the flow of how these things go. So as I mentioned, I will always try to keep Holy Shock on cooldown. There's going to be a massive amount of nuance to everything that I'm doing. But as a general rule of thumb, that's what I do. Whenever Holy Shock is available, that's what I use first. So there you go. Holy Shock comes up. That's what I use first as soon as I can. Now, there is a realization, or there's a realization that I came to, and that is that Holy Paladin right now is extremely bursty. So it's really hard to find examples where the base core rotation would come into play and really shine, because for the most part there's a lot of pause and a lot of places where the core rotation breaks and you focus much more on the timing of things. In raids it's a different story. However, in raids I am currently playing a lot more with Avenging Crusader, which is a talent that changes the way Wings works, and it also changes a lot your core your core rotation of Holy Paladin. So all that nuance we will be covering in further videos, but for now, yeah, let's just focus on what I'm doing here, which would be using Holy Shock as much as possible, as I mentioned, Hammer Wrath if available, and next up would be Crusader Strike. I want to use something and I don't really have anything to heal, or I cannot be in melee, so I would use a Holy Shock for the sake of it. Holy Shock available, I'm gonna put it on cooldown as much as I can. There's also things in the middle, like applying, for example, beacons right there, as you saw, like it's something that we will talk about later on. There's also consuming a buff. That's why I casted a Holy Light right there, consuming a buff, Divine Favor, which enhances the healing that I do through Holy Light, and that's a reason why you would want to be using Holy Light rather than anything else. But yeah, a lot of nuance to pretty much everything, as you can see, and the core rotation kind of lags, but there you go, you can see Hammer of Wrath, Holy Shock, now using another of one of our cooldowns, which is Aura Mastery, reducing the damage that the whole party is taking, but a lot of emphasis in the timing of things. something's gonna happen, we apply our beacons, and then that's when we do the healing. We wanna be ready with the holy power before the damage happens. So all those little nuances really are much more advanced to anybody that's new to Holy Paladin. But just try to see how the things are flowing, how Holy Shock is pretty much always on cooldown, how I am trying to also use Crusader Strike whenever I need, but I am also heavily using Judgment for the sake of damage, because there's a lot of situations where you can't really be in melee here, so I end up just using that instead. But if I can, I will be using Crusader Strike for the Holy Power. I will be going in there, using those Holy Shocks as often as possible. As soon as it's up, I am trying to put it on cooldown immediately if I can, and I have to. But there is other ways of doing more healing. That's why, for example, here I just consumed Divine Favor, a buff that I have with that Holy Light. It's gonna be doing a big burst of healing when I am using that buff, also making the cast of the Holy Light faster. So yeah, I hope you see a little bit of a pattern here, how important it is to keep Holy Shock on cooldown. It's not a raiding environment, so things change a lot from raiding to Mythic Plus. As I mentioned, it's a lot more bursty, the nature of the healing in Mythic Plus, so it changes health rotation a lot. We also play with beacons, a beacon of virtue, so we kind of have to time everything around that window whenever we need the healing to be done. Like, for example, right here, big burst of damage, we have our Divine Toll, everything's reversed because we have our beacons active. So the nuance in how to play is massive, but I hope at least you get something out of this practical example. And I don't really have the footage for you for a raiding setup that would actually match the core rotation of Holy Paladin. So, hope you enjoyed the video, guys. I hope you liked it. Please drop a like if you did so. Subscribe if you want to see any further content in my channel. Next coming episodes for this beginner series for Holy Paladin, we'll be having more stuff as soon as I record it. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.